Do you think that when humans invented firearms, they were already firing bullets similar to those we see today? Wrong, completely wrong. The first firearms in history didn't even fire bullets. They spat out stones, pieces of metal, shards, and even coins. And the most shocking thing, for almost 500 years, nobody had the slightest idea of how to make a projectile that actually worked well. The bullet, that piece of metal that seems so obvious and simple today, is actually the result of centuries of mistakes, explosions in people's faces, soldiers mutilated by malfunctioning weapons, and a sequence of desperate solutions that, one after the other, built what you imagine to be a bullet. And before we dive into this incredible story, if you enjoy understanding how things truly began, behind the myths and simplified versions, subscribe to the channel here. This greatly helps the channel grow and bring you more content like this. Going back, to understand how we arrived at the modern bullet, we need to go back to a time when gunpowder was an almost magical novelty, but nobody knew what to do with it. When gunpowder arrived in Europe from China around the 13th century, it didn't come with an instruction manual. The first firearms were metal tubes, and the logic was simple. Put gunpowder inside, put something in front of it, and light a fuse. But that something was the problem. In the beginning, early gunners literally used whatever they had on hand: shaped stones, irregular pieces of iron, shards of glass, coins, nails, anything that would fit in the barrel and could be launched by the gunpowder explosion. The problem was that this was a disaster in terms of accuracy and safety. Stones shattered inside the barrel. Irregular pieces of metal created uneven friction, causing the projectile to come out crooked, or worse, exploding the barrel itself in the face of the shooter. Imagine trusting your life to a weapon that had a real chance of exploding in your hand instead of hitting the enemy. That was the reality for the first snipers in history. It was this brutal instability that forced the next stage of evolution. Someone needed to standardize the projectile's shape. And that's where a material that would seem obvious to anyone today came in, but which at the time was a game changer: lead. Lead solved at once a problem that no one had been able to solve until then: shape. Unlike stone, which broke, or raw iron, which was difficult to mold without heavy equipment, lead had an almost magical advantage for the time. It melts at a low temperature, relatively easy to achieve in a bonfire or simple forge, and when it cools, it maintains its shape perfectly. This meant something revolutionary. For the first time, it was possible to manufacture spherical round projectiles, identical to each other in large quantities. Then came bullet molds, metal pieces with a spherical shape carved inside, where the soldier, or more often an artisan, poured molten lead and waited for it to cool. The result was a virtually perfect lead ball, ready to be loaded into the gun barrel. This wasn't just an aesthetic improvement. It was a revolution in consistency. A round projectile the same size every time meant that the shooter could finally predict, with some degree of accuracy, where the bullet would go. And here's a historical irony that few people know. Lead wasn't chosen solely for its ease of melting. It's also extremely dense. This means that even in a small piece, it carries a lot of mass, which translates into more impact energy. A lead sphere the size of a large olive could cause absurdly more serious injuries than a stone of the same size. Without knowing exactly the physics behind it, the gunsmiths of the time discovered, in practice, something that today we explain with formulas for momentum and kinetic energy. But, like every solution in this story, this one also brought a new problem. And that problem had a name: long-range accuracy. The weapons of that era had completely smooth barrels, the famous smoothbore muskets. And here's something that goes against many people's intuition. A perfectly round sphere, fired from a completely smooth barrel, actually flies unpredictably. Without any stabilizing rotation, the lead bullet tends to stagger in the air, deviating almost randomly. An experienced marksman with a smoothbore musket was lucky if he hit a target the size of a person more than 50 or 60 meters away. In battles, armies compensated for this imprecision in a brutal way. They placed hundreds of soldiers side by side, firing at the same time, hoping that in quantity, some shots would hit the target. It wasn't about aiming well. It was about statistics. However, there were soldiers, especially hunters and sharpshooters, who noticed something curious. While observing the behavior of feathered arrows and other rotating objects, when a projectile spins around its own axis while flying, it becomes much more stable, and its trajectory becomes much more predictable. It was this seemingly simple observation that opened the door to one of the most important inventions in the history of firearms: rifled barrels, or rifles as we know them today. Instead of a perfectly smooth barrel, gunsmiths began carving spiral grooves into the inside of the barrel. When the lead bullet was fired, these grooves forced the projectile to spin around itself, just like a well-feathered arrow or a well-thrown American football. This spin created a gyroscopic effect that stabilized the bullet's flight, making the shot drastically more accurate, even at much greater distances. But this ingenious solution brought with it a gigantic problem, one that would delay the military adoption of rifled barrels for almost 200 years. The problem was simple to understand and absurdly difficult to solve. For the grooves of the rifled barrel to actually grip the lead bullet and make it spin, the projectile needed to be slightly larger than the internal diameter of the barrel. Only then would it fit tightly enough into the grooves. But this meant that, when loading the weapon, the soldier literally had to force the bullet into the barrel, pushing with a ramrod and, often, with a hammer. This made the process of reloading a rifled weapon extremely slow, something that could take a full minute or more, while a smoothbore musket, less accurate but much faster, could be reloaded in seconds. Imagine the tactical dilemma. In the heat of battle, with the enemy advancing, would you prefer a weapon that fires quickly but misses frequently, or an extremely accurate weapon that takes so long to reload that you can barely fire 2 shots before being overwhelmed? Because of this dilemma, for a long time rifled barrels were restricted to hunters and specialized marksmen, being practically unfeasible for mass use in armies. It wasn't until the 19th century that a French officer named Claude-Étienne Minié found a brilliant solution to this impasse. Instead of manufacturing a bullet the exact size of the barrel, forcing it into place, he had a counterintuitive idea. What if the bullet was slightly smaller than the barrel? Easy to insert, but with a special shape that would cause it to expand automatically upon firing. The so-called Minié bullet had a conical shape, no longer spherical, with a hollow cavity at the base. When the gunpowder exploded, the pressure of the gases pushed this hollow base, instantly expanding it against the walls of the barrel, precisely at the moment of firing, and not before. This meant that the soldier could reload the weapon quickly, as he did with a regular musket, but still obtain all the precision and stability of a rifled barrel. It was an elegant solution that solved at once 2 problems that seemed completely incompatible: reloading speed and accuracy. And here is a brutal irony of history. This invention, created to make combat more efficient, played a direct role in the frightening number of dead and wounded during the American Civil War. Since entire armies still used combat tactics designed for inaccurate weapons, while now carrying weapons capable of killing accurately at much greater distances. Technology advanced faster than military tactics could keep up, but even with the Minié bullet solving the problem of shape and reloading, there was still a huge bottleneck in the process. The gunpowder, the bullet, and in many cases, the ignition primer were all separate components that needed to be handled individually by the soldier for each shot. This still made the process slow, prone to errors, and extremely vulnerable to moisture, since the loose gunpowder could get wet and simply not fire. It was this fragmentation of the process that led to the next great revolution. Why not unite everything? Gunpowder, primer, and projectile into a single piece? Thus was born the metallic cartridge, a small capsule, initially made of brass containing gunpowder, attached at the base to a case with the bullet fitted at the tip, and an ignition system integrated into the rear base. For the first time in history, a soldier could simply insert a single piece into the weapon, fire, and the weapon's own mechanism would automatically eject the empty case, making room for the next charge. This wasn't just a convenience improvement, it was a complete revolution in rate of fire, protection against moisture, and most importantly, it paved the way for something that would change warfare forever: repeating firearms, capable of firing multiple shots without the shooter having to manually reload each component. But this new metal capsule brought with it its own technical challenges, especially when it came to ensuring that the ignition functioned reliably, shot after shot, in any weather condition. The first major challenge of the metallic cartridge was the primer, the small component responsible for generating the spark that ignited the gunpowder. Early attempts used a chemical compound called mercury fulminate, extremely sensitive to impact, enough to detonate with a small blow from the firing pin. The problem was that this sensitivity came at a high price. Mercury fulminate was unstable, corroded the metal of the barrel over time, and in some cases was too dangerous even to store in large quantities, accidentally exploding in military depots. It wasn't until the early 20th century that ammunition engineers developed more stable compounds, such as lead styphnate, which became the standard for modern primers. This seemingly small advance solved a huge problem. It was now possible to trust that, shot after shot, the ammunition would fire consistently, without corroding weapons or posing an absurd storage risk. Before we continue, if this kind of story behind inventions is captivating you, Leave a like and comment below what you've thought so far. This really helps the video reach more people. While the fuse evolved, another gigantic problem still plagued armies worldwide: smoke. Traditional gunpowder, known today as black powder, produced an absurd amount of dense white smoke with each shot. On a battlefield with hundreds or thousands of soldiers firing simultaneously, visibility simply disappeared in a few minutes, forming a thick cloud that hid both the enemy and their own comrades. Furthermore, this smoke immediately revealed the position of the shooter, a very serious tactical problem. The solution came at the end of the 19th century with the development of so-called smokeless powder, created from compounds such as nitrocellulose. Unlike black powder, this new chemical composition burned much cleaner and more efficiently, releasing far less solid residue and, consequently, much less visible smoke. But the benefits didn't stop there. Smokeless powder was also significantly more powerful, generating more energy per gram of material, which allowed for the creation of faster bullets with flatter trajectories and greater range, without needing to increase the cartridge size. This set of advancements, the aerodynamic bullet shape, the unified metallic cartridge, the stable primer, and smokeless powder, finally converged into what we recognize today as modern ammunition. Contemporary bullets have evolved even further, gaining lead cores coated with an outer layer of copper, the so-called full metallic coating, which reduces wear inside the barrel and improves stability at very high speeds. Today there are even bullets designed to expand in specific ways upon hitting a target, or to minimize air resistance during flight, an extremely refined engineering feat that would have been unimaginable for that medieval gunner stuffing a stone into a metal tube. And it is precisely here that this story reveals something profoundly important. When we look at a modern bullet, it seems like a simple, almost banal object. But in reality, it carries within it centuries of trial and error. Soldiers wounded by exploding weapons, engineers obsessed with solving one problem at a time, and an uninterrupted sequence of small improvements that, in isolation, seemed insignificant, but which together completely changed the way wars are fought, how empires rose and fell, and how human technology itself evolved. There wasn't a single inventor of the bullet. There was a chain of people, each solving the problem they faced, without imagining that they were building, piece by piece, one of the most defining objects in the history of world military life. And that is perhaps the most powerful lesson of this whole story. The greatest transformations in humanity rarely arise from a single moment of genius. They are born from the silent accumulation of small solutions, one after the other, until, looking back, we realize that we changed the world without even noticing the exact moment it happened. If you've made it this far, leave a like, comment on what surprised you most about this evolution, and click on the video that's appearing on your screen now, because it continues this story in a way you won't want to miss.